All right, get ready for a deep dive. Today we're looking into a seriously disturbing case, the story of Genene Jones.
Oh, yeah.
This nurse, suspected of killing, get this, dozens of infants and children.
Wow.
It's a tough one to even grasp,
Yeah.
but we're going to try to unpack it the best we can, using what we've got, court records, news articles, spanning decades.
It's a case that, really gets you thinking.
Okay.
How could someone, especially a caregiver, do something so horrific?
Exactly, and it all seems to start so normal. Genene Jones, she had like a pretty typical upbringing, adopted. Her dad owned a nightclub. Nothing that screams, criminal mastermind.
Right.
She even worked as a beautician before going to nursing school in the late 70s.
Huh.
No red flags there, what you think?
I mean, it just goes to show you can't judge a book by its cover.
Yeah.
But the real puzzle is how someone goes from an ordinary life to being accused of these unthinkable acts. Really makes you think about human nature, the potential for darkness.
Absolutely, and that darkness, it becomes even more apparent when we look at her nursing career.
Right.
So Jones starts working at Bexar County Hospital in the pediatric ICU.
Okay.
And, well, that's when the trouble really begins. A statistically improbable number of children die under her care.
Yeah, and that's a huge red flag, in these types of cases.
Absolutely.
Tragically, though, these kinds of patterns, they often go unnoticed until it's way too late.
Yeah. And in this case, instead of doing a full investigation, the hospital, they were worried about lawsuits.
Of course.
So they just asked all their LVNs to resign, just like that.
Wow.
They replaced them with RNs in the ICU, but no real investigation into Jones.
This is where it gets really, really troubling.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. The hospital's main responsibility should be patient safety,
Right.
not protecting their own image, right?
Absolutely.
By not investigating, they potentially put other kids at risk, maybe even obstructed justice.
Yeah.
And sadly, this kind of cover-up, it's happened in other places too.
It's a scary thought. So Jones, she moves on, starts working at a doctor's office.
Okay.
And that's where things take a really dramatic turn. She's charged with raising 6 children.
6 children, wow.
It makes you wonder, right?
Yeah.
Was it harder for her to operate in that smaller setting?
Possibly, yeah. Harder to blend in.
Yeah, and this time, there's physical evidence.
Okay.
A doctor found punctured vials of 6-phenylcholine.
Oh, wow. That's a powerful muscle relaxant.
Yeah, normally it's used in controlled settings like surgery.
Right, to induce temporary paralysis.
Exactly, but in the wrong hands, especially with kids, it can be really dangerous.
Oh, incredibly dangerous. Especially with children, their systems are so much more sensitive.
Absolutely.
6-phenylcholine can stop their breathing, lead to cardiac arrest.
And what's really chilling is that she had access to this drug.
Yeah.
And allegedly used it to harm these kids.
It's a tough one to wrap your head around.
It is. And when confronted, Jones had a bizarre explanation.
Oh, really?
Yeah, she claimed she was trying to, get this, stimulate the creation of a pediatric ICU in Kerrville.
By harming children.
By harming children, yeah.
It's a tough justification to accept, to say the least.
Yeah.
It sounds more like a desperate attempt to make sense of something truly awful.
Right.
Makes you wonder if she really believed that, or if it was just manipulation.
Yeah, it's hard to know for sure. But the courts, they weren't buying it.
Yeah.
So in 1984, Jones is convicted of murdering 15-month-old Chelsea McClellan.
Oh, wow.
She gets 99 years for that. And then a concurrent 6-year sentence for nearly killing another child, Rolando Santos.
Concurrent sentences, that means they're served at the same time, right?
That's right. So basically a 99-year sentence for both.
Okay.
But here's where it gets even more complex. Back then, Texas had these overcrowding laws,
Right.
which could lead to early release for inmates, even those convicted of serious crimes.
True. Even with a 99-year sentence, Jones could potentially get out much earlier.
Exactly. And fast forward to 2017, the unthinkable almost happened. Genene Jones was scheduled for mandatory release.
Because of those overcrowding laws.
Yes, because of those laws. And the families of her victims, the community, they were terrified.
Oh, I can imagine. That must have been a race against time to keep her behind bars.
It was. And that's when prosecutors did something that changed everything.
Okay.
They had decided to go for a new indictment against Jones for the 1981 murder of 11-month-old Joshua Sawyer.
Wow, so they're reopening a case that was decades old.
Yes. This case had been unsolved for years, but they were determined to use it to keep her locked up.
That's a bold move. A lot of legal and ethical questions come with that.
It was a risky move, no doubt, but it worked. The indictment delayed Jones's release, giving them more time to build a case against her for Joshua Sawyer's murder.
But that's not the end of the story.
It's a case that just keeps unfolding.
It does.
Yeah.
So what do you think? How did this new indictment change things? What did it mean for Jones and for the prosecution?
Well, for Jones, it meant she was facing another murder trial.
And potentially even more years added to her sentence. But for the prosecution, it was a chance to finally get justice for Joshua Sawyer and his family and to make sure Jones wouldn't be released.
It must have been an incredibly difficult decision for them to make, right?
Absolutely.
To reopen a decades-old case with all that pressure of public safety on their shoulders.
Absolutely. And this brings us to a fascinating aspect of this case, something you see a lot in true crime, but it's often misunderstood. Munchausen syndrome by proxy.
Okay, yeah, I've heard of that, but I'm not really sure what it is.
Right. Well, some experts think this condition might explain Jones's alleged actions.
Okay, so for our listener, can you break that down? What exactly is Munchausen syndrome by proxy?
So it's this complex mental health condition where a caregiver, often a parent, they make up or even cause illness in someone they're caring for, usually a child, and the motivation. Often it's this twisted desire for attention, for sympathy.
Oh, wow.
They might exaggerate symptoms, mess with medical tests, even hurt the child to create a medical crisis.
So they're creating the problem so they can be the hero.
Exactly. Like a need to be seen as indispensable, but in a really messed up way.
Yeah, that's disturbing.
And it's really hard to diagnose and prove. Often there's no physical evidence, and the caregiver, they're good at manipulating people.
They can fool everyone.
Right. They might seem devoted, attentive, so nobody suspects anything.
So was Genene Jones ever officially diagnosed with this? With Munchausen syndrome by proxy?
No, she wasn't. And it's important to say that this is just one theory, okay?
Right.
Based on what we know about her alleged behavior, not an official diagnosis,
Okay.
but the pattern of her actions, creating these medical emergencies, it does line up with some of the characteristics.
So even without a diagnosis, looking at this theory can give us some insight into why she might have done what she did.
Exactly. It adds another layer of complexity to this already really puzzling case.
It does, and it raises questions about how we can better spot these situations in healthcare.
Oh, absolutely. It makes you think about the safeguards we need to protect vulnerable patients from people who might want to exploit them.
If we zoom out a bit, Jones's case exposed some serious vulnerabilities in the healthcare system. Vulnerabilities that maybe allowed her crimes to continue for so long.
It's a good point. It's not just about one person's actions, but the system that failed to stop them.
Exactly.
Remember how the hospital dealt with those initial deaths in the ICU?
Yeah.
They cared more about their reputation than about investigating what was really going on.
And that lack of accountability, it creates an environment where someone like Jones can thrive.
It's a chilling thought.
It is.
Yeah.
So what lessons can we learn from this? How can we stop similar tragedies from happening?
Well, first off, we need stricter background checks for healthcare professionals.
Yeah.
And we need better systems to track patient outcomes, to flag anything unusual.
Like a suspicious number of deaths under one caregiver.
Exactly. But technology can only do so much, right?
Right.
We also need to address the human element. We need a culture where people feel safe speaking up when something seems wrong.
Absolutely. Whistleblowers need to be protected, not punished.
Exactly. We need to shift from silence and fear to transparency and accountability.
People shouldn't be afraid to raise concerns, to question authority, to say, hey, something's not right here.
Exactly. And that needs a change in how we think about power in healthcare.
Yeah.
We need to empower nurses, doctors, everyone to be active in patient safety, not just passive observers.
And let's not forget the impact this case had on the legal system in Texas.
That's right. Jones's case actually led to big changes in Texas law.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they brought in tougher penalties for harming children
Good.
because they recognized how vulnerable kids are and the need to deter these crimes.
So their suffering led to reforms that could protect others in the future.
It's a bittersweet outcome, but an important one. It shows the power of speaking out and of constantly checking and updating our laws to meet new challenges.
And speaking of legal challenges, let's get back to Genene Jones and the new charges for Joshua Sawyer's murder.
Okay.
How did she react to this new indictment? Did she maintain her innocence or did she try a new strategy?
Well, facing more evidence and the possibility of, life in prison,
Yeah.
Genene Jones, she decided on a different strategy.
Right.
Instead of going to trial, risking another conviction, she went for a plea bargain in 2020.
What plea bargain?
Yeah, it's that agreement between the defendant and the prosecution,
Right.
where the defendant pleads guilty maybe to a lesser charge or to some of the charges in exchange for, like, a shorter sentence or something else they want.
So what did that mean for Genene Jones and the case?
Well, in her case, she admitted guilt to the murder of Joshua Sawyer.
Okay.
And in return, the prosecution dropped 4 other charges they had against her.
So what happened then?
She got a life sentence.
Wow.
But as part of the deal, she can be considered for parole in 2037.
2037, so that's...
when she turns 87.
It's tough knowing she could get out. But at least this plea bargain brought some closure.
Yeah.
And it guaranteed she'd be held responsible for at least one of her alleged crimes.
Right, and think about it. It also spared the families another trial.
Oh, yeah.
Which would have been long and painful, especially with these cases going back decades.
It's a lot to ask of them to go through all that again.
Absolutely. Sometimes a plea bargain, even if it doesn't feel perfect, is the best way to get justice and some kind of resolution.
Yeah, I see your point.
It reminds us that the legal system isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about finding that balance between holding someone accountable, fairness, and what's best for the victims and their families.
That makes sense. And this brings us to a really unsettling truth about this whole case.
What's that?
We might never know everything Genene Jones did.
Oh, right.
They think she may have been responsible for over 60 deaths.
Wow.
Infants and children.
60.
But without complete medical records, it's impossible to be sure.
The thought that so many innocent lives might have been lost and we'll never have all the answers, it's really disturbing.
And to make matters worse, a lot of the medical records from back then are gone.
Oh, no.
Lost, destroyed, maybe even by the hospital.
That makes it even harder to find out the truth, to bring closure to the families.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing.
Yeah.
You can kind of see the outline of this awful story, but the details are lost.
And that loss of evidence, it not only stops us from getting justice, but it also takes away the chance for the victims and their families to truly understand what happened.
It's heartbreaking to think about those families left behind.
Yeah.
All those unanswered questions, that deep sense of loss.
Their stories really show us the human cost of these crimes.
Right.
These weren't just numbers. They were children with families who loved them, families whose lives were changed forever by these tragedies.
It's hard to even imagine. And, this case has gone way beyond the hospital and the courtroom.
I mean, it's become a huge part of popular culture, right?
Exactly. It's been captivating and horrifying people for years.
It's a story that gets to people, maybe because it touches on those deep fears we have.
About innocence being violated, about evil hiding in plain sight.
Exactly. Even Stephen King, the king of horror himself, has said that Genene Jones inspired him.
Wow, really?
Yeah, for Annie Wilkes, that scary nurse in his book Misery.
It just shows how chilling this case is.
It really captures the imagination, even in fiction.
Right.
That idea of someone who's supposed to care for you turning into a monster, it's really unsettling.
And it's been explored in so many documentaries and TV shows about Genene Jones.
People just can't seem to get enough of this story.
I get it. It's fascinating and terrifying at the same time. But it's more than just a true crime story.
Right.
It makes us think about human nature, about how systems fail, about the need to be careful and hold people accountable.
It also brings up some big ethical questions with no easy answers.
Like, how do we balance the rights of someone who's been convicted with the need to protect everyone else?
Yeah, and how do we make sure justice is served while still considering the possibility that someone can change?
Those are tough questions, ones that we're still struggling with.
Absolutely. Not just with Genene Jones, but with so many other cases involving violence and the chance someone might do it again.
It's a discussion that needs to keep happening.
For sure.
We have to think about the law, our values, and keeping everyone safe.
It's a complex issue.
It is. So as we finish up our deep dive into this case, we're left with one last question for you to think about.
Okay, I'm listening.
Could something like this happen again today? What's in place now that wasn't back then? And what can we do, each of us, to make sure these tragedies don't happen again?
It's a question we all need to think about
Yeah.
and act on. We can't just sit back. We have to learn from what happened, try to make our systems better, and stay committed to fighting for justice and protecting the most vulnerable among us.
I agree. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the case of Genene Jones.
It was my pleasure.
It's a story that will stay with us, and one that I hope makes us all more aware, more involved, and more dedicated to making a safer and fairer world?
So she was facing, a mountain of evidence against her.
Right.
And the very real possibility of, spending the rest of her life in prison.
Yeah.
Genene Jones, she kind of changed her approach. Instead of going to trial and, risking another conviction, she decided to take a plea bargain.
A plea bargain in 2020?
Yeah, in 2020.
So for our listener who may not be familiar,
right.
What exactly is a plea bargain?
So a plea bargain is basically, it's an agreement between the defendant and the prosecution, where the defendant says, okay, I'm guilty, maybe to a lesser charge or to some of the charges, not all of them. But in exchange, they get something, maybe a shorter sentence or some other concession.
I see.
So it's like a deal.
Got it.
So in Jones's case, she pleaded guilty to murdering Joshua Sawyer.
Right.
And because of that plea, the prosecution dropped 4 other charges against her, and she got a life sentence.
A life sentence?
But here's the thing. The deal included the possibility of parole in 2037.
2037.
When she'll be 87 years old.
So there's a chance she might get out.
Yeah, it's a tough thing to process.
It is.
But at least this plea bargain gave some closure.
Some closure, yeah.
And it guaranteed that she'd be held accountable, for at least one of the crimes she was accused of.
I guess it also spared the families from another trial.
Oh, absolutely. Think about it. These cases are decades old.
Yeah.
Having to go through another long, drawn-out trial, it would be incredibly painful for them.
It would be asking a lot.
It would.
Yeah.
So sometimes a plea bargain, even if it doesn't feel totally right, is the best way to get justice.
To find some resolution.
Yeah, exactly.
I get it. It's not about perfect outcomes every time.
Right. It reminds us that the legal system isn't always about just punishing someone. It's about finding that balance between holding them responsible, being fair, and thinking about what the victims and their families need. That makes sense. So it's a complex process.
It is. And this leads us to, a really unsettling truth about this whole case.
What's that?
We may never truly know the full extent of what Genene Jones did.
Right, because of the missing records?
Yeah, they suspect she might have been responsible for the deaths of over 60 infants and children.
Over 60?
But without all the medical records, it's impossible to be certain.
It's just the thought that so many innocent lives might have been lost, and we might never have all the answers. It's really, really disturbing.
It is. And to make matters worse, a lot of those medical records are just gone.
Like, what happened to them?
Lost, destroyed. Who knows? Some might have even been destroyed by the hospital.
Wow. That just makes it so much harder to get to the truth, to bring any kind of peace to those families.
Yeah, it's like imagine trying to solve a puzzle, but you only have half the pieces.
Right. You can kind of see what the picture might be, but you'll never get the full picture.
Exactly. And those missing pieces, they represent real lives, real loss.
It's a tragedy. And that loss of evidence, it not only hinders our ability to achieve justice, but it also robs the victims and their families of a full understanding of what happened.
It's heartbreaking to think about all those families left behind, just grappling with all those unanswered questions and that deep sense of loss.
It's a powerful reminder of the human cost of these crimes. We're not talking about statistics. We're talking about children who had families who loved them, families whose lives were completely shattered by what happened.
You're right. It's so much bigger than just one person's actions.
Absolutely.
And, this case, it's not just confined to the hospital and the courtroom.
It's become this huge part of popular culture, right?
It has. It's been captivating and terrifying people for decades.
It's a story that really gets under your skin, Maybe because it touches on some of our deepest fears.
About the vulnerability of innocence. The potential for evil to be lurking right there where we least expect it.
Exactly. Even Stephen King, the master of horror himself, said that Genene Jones was part of what inspired him to create Annie Wilkes.
No way, really?
Yeah, that terrifying nurse in his book, Misery.
That's wild.
It really speaks to the chilling nature of this case and how it captures the imagination, even in fiction.
It does.
The idea of a caregiver becoming a tormentor is just so unsettling. And it's something that's been explored in countless true crime documentaries and TV shows about Genene Jones.
Yeah, it's like people are both fascinated and horrified by her story.
Absolutely.
And it's understandable, right? It's a complex case with so many unanswered questions.
It is. And it forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about ourselves, about how our systems can fail and how important it is to be vigilant and hold people accountable.
And I think it raises some really big ethical questions.
Oh, absolutely. Questions that don't have easy answers.
Like, how do we balance the rights of someone who's been convicted of a crime with the need to keep everyone else safe?
Right, and how do we ensure that justice is served while also recognizing the possibility of rehabilitation?
Yeah, those are questions we're still struggling with as a society.
It's a constant conversation we need to have.
It is, not just with this case, but with countless others involving violent crime and the possibility that someone might harm someone again.
It's a complicated issue that needs a lot of thought and discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we wrap up our deep dive into the case of Genene Jones, we're left with one final thought-provoking question for you to consider.
Okay, hit me with it.
Could something like this happen again? What safeguards are in place now that weren't back then? And what can we do, each of us, to make sure that tragedies like this don't happen again?
It's a question that deserves our attention, our reflection, and most importantly, our action.
Action, yeah.
We can't just be bystanders. We have to learn from what happened, try to make our systems better, and stay committed to the pursuit of justice and the protection of those who are most vulnerable.
Well said. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the case of Genene Jones.
It was my pleasure.
It's a story that will stay with us long after this episode ends, and I hope it encourages us all to be more aware, more involved, and more committed to creating a safer and more just world for everyone.